I didn't want to check the call log again. Not because I was scared, I was way past scared, but because the truth felt heavier than the Glock on my hip. My shift as a patrol officer started at 7 p.m., and by midnight, we had 3 911 calls reporting someone banging on doors in the Ridgewood neighborhood. Each time, the caller described the same thing. A man in a black hoodie with no face. Not a mask, not shadows, just nothing where his face should have been. I figured it was a prank or someone high off their mind. But then came call number 4, and everything changed. It wasn't a neighbor reporting suspicious activity. It was a blood-chilling scream caught by the dispatcher before the line went dead. That's when my sergeant, an old-school cop named Tennyson, barked at me and my partner to take a closer look. "Check it out, but stay sharp," he said. "People around here don't just scream for no reason." We pulled up to the intersection of Ridgewood and Elm, red and blues washing over the eerily quiet streets. Even with the heater blasting in the cruiser, my skin crawled. My partner, a rookie named Brooks, gripped the flashlight like it was a lifeline. I tried to project confidence, but the truth, I was sweating bullets. "Let's make this quick," I muttered. We stepped out into the biting cold, boots crunching against frost-covered asphalt. The houses were dark, the streetlights dimmer than they should have been. Something felt wrong, and then we saw it. A single shoe lying in the middle of the road. Brooks crouched to pick it up, but I stopped him. "Don't touch it. Just don't." I couldn't explain why, but something about that lone shoe, stark and solitary under the flickering street lamp, made my stomach turn. "Do you hear that?" Brooks whispered. I froze. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no, it was low, guttural breathing. It was coming from the alley to our left. "Police!" I called out, drawing my weapon. "Come out with your hands up." The breathing stopped. And then, like a scene ripped straight from a nightmare, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, lanky, with a black hoodie pulled tight over its head. Its face, or the absence of it, was worse than I imagined. It wasn't just featureless. It seemed to absorb the light around it, like a void carved into the world itself. Brooks gasped, stepping back. I shouted again, voice trembling now. "Show your hands! Do it now!" It didn't move. Not until I heard that sound. Metal scraping against pavement. I looked down. It was dragging something. Crowbar. No, not just dragging it. Pulling it toward us like it was trying to decide who to hit first. Brooks' breathing turned erratic, loud enough to echo in the dead silent street. I nudged him with my elbow, trying to keep us grounded. "Stay focused," I hissed, but my own voice betrayed me. My hands were trembling, the Glock in my grip feeling suddenly inadequate. The thing with no face tilted its head. Not a curious gesture, but something predatory, like it was sizing us up. Then it raised the crowbar, its blackened outline shimmering faintly under the flickering street lamp. "Stop right there," I barked, stepping forward to put myself between it and Brooks. "Drop the weapon, or I'll shoot." It didn't drop it. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there for a heartbeat too long, the air between us growing colder. And then, without warning, it charged. I fired. One shot, center mass. The sound shattered the night like glass. The thing stumbled back, clutching its chest. Relief surged through me for half a second, until it straightened up like nothing had happened. No blood, no reaction. Just that void where its face should be, staring us down. "Jesus Christ," Brooks whispered, panic flooding his voice. "Back to the car," I yelled, grabbing his arm. "Now!" We bolted, boots pounding against the asphalt. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I could hear it behind us, the rhythmic thud of its footsteps, faster than they had any right to be. It wasn't running. It was gliding, closing the distance without any sign of effort. We reached the cruiser, slamming the doors shut just as the thing reached the passenger side window. Its faceless head pressed against the glass, leaving no fog, no mark, just emptiness. Brooks was hyperventilating beside me, fumbling for the radio. "Dispatch. Officer 824, we need backup. Suspect down Ridgewood and Elm." His voice cracked. He's not human. Send. The thing slammed the crowbar against the window, hard enough to spiderweb the glass. I floored the accelerator. The tires screeched, and the cruiser lurched forward, throwing us against our seats. "Did you hit him?" Brooks asked, his voice rising with hysteria. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the thing sprawled on the ground. But no, it was there, chasing us, keeping pace. Its movements weren't natural. It flickered, like a bad signal on a security camera, darting forward in disjointed leaps. "What the hell is that?" Brooks screamed. "I don't know," I yelled back. "But we're not sticking around to find out." The cruiser tore through the streets, lights flashing, siren wailing. I took a hard left, tires skidding on the icy pavement, hoping to lose it. For a moment, the mirror showed nothing but empty streets. My pulse started to slow until I saw it again. Not running, standing, in the middle of the road ahead of us. I swerved, narrowly missing it, and the cruiser plowed into a mailbox. The airbags deployed with a deafening whomp, knocking the wind out of me. I shoved it aside, gasping for air. Brooks was already clawing at the door, scrambling out. "Don't wait!" I shouted, but it was too late. He was out in the open, flashlight trembling in his hand. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, holding the crowbar loosely at its side. Then it raised its arm, slowly, pointing at Brooks. "Back up!" Brooks yelled, his voice cracking. "Stay back or I'll..." It tilted its head again, that same eerie gesture, and then it dropped the crowbar. The clang echoed unnaturally loud in the cold night air. Brooks hesitated, lowering his weapon for just a fraction of a second. And that's when the streetlights went out. The darkness swallowed everything. No moonlight, no flicker from the busted cruiser's headlights. Just pure, suffocating black. I could hear Brooks fumbling around outside, his panicked breaths cutting through the silence. "Brooks, get back in the car!" I shouted, but my voice felt small, lost in the void. And then, the breathing started again. That same guttural, wet rasp from before, but now it was everywhere, surrounding us. I groped blindly for my flashlight, but my shaking hands couldn't find it. I reached for my gun instead, the cold steel grounding me just enough to keep from losing it completely. "Brooks, do you see it?" My voice was hoarse, cracking under the pressure. I don't know where it is," he screamed. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness in erratic sweeps, but it revealed nothing. Just empty street. The thing was gone. And then, a sound I'll never forget. A low, dragging scrape, metal against asphalt, followed by the sharp snap of footsteps, moving too fast, too erratically. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from all directions. "Get back to the car now," I bellowed, throwing open my door. Brooks didn't answer. His flashlight beam dropped to the ground, spinning as it hit the pavement. The breathing got louder, joined now by something worse. A deep, inhuman growl. "Brooks!" I screamed again, stepping out of the cruiser with my weapon drawn. The flashlight beam was still spinning, but Brooks was nowhere in sight. Just an empty stretch of road. My chest tightened as I backed toward the car, the pistol shaking in my hands. That's when I saw it. Far down the street, silhouetted against the void, stood the thing. Its faceless head was tilted again, unnaturally far, as if mocking me. And in its hand, swinging loosely by the collar, was Brooks' body. I froze. It lifted Brooks effortlessly, his limp form dangling like a broken doll. Then, with an almost casual motion, it tossed him. The sound of his body hitting the ground made my stomach lurch. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The thing started toward me, slow at first, each step deliberate. I raised my gun, aiming center mass again. "Stop!" I yelled, though I knew it wouldn't. "I swear to God, stop!" It didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. I fired 3 shots, each one echoing into the night. The rounds hit. I saw them connect. But the thing didn't even stagger. Kept coming, faster now, breaking into that unnatural, flickering sprint. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something in me snapped. I dropped to my knees, aimed higher this time, and fired again. Straight at its head. The thing stopped. Not from the bullet it didn't hit. It stopped because the streetlights flickered back on. For the first time, I saw its full form, illuminated in the stark, unnatural glow. It wasn't just faceless. Its entire body seemed wrong, like it wasn't made of flesh or bone. Its edges shimmered, blurred, as if it wasn't fully tethered to this reality. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it dissolved. One moment it was there, the next gone. Not a trace left behind, just silence. I stumbled toward Brooks, my knees nearly giving out. He was breathing, thank God, but barely. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. It wasn't real, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. It can't be real. The sound of distant sirens broke through the night. Backup was finally arriving. I sank to the ground, my weapon still clutched in my trembling hands. The thing might have disappeared, but the streetlights above us were still flickering, like a warning. Even now, I can't explain what we saw that night. I filed my report, sanitized it for the record, but the images won't leave my mind. The void where its face should have been, the impossible speed, the way it looked at me as if it knew me. I'm not sure if it's gone for good, or if it's waiting, watching. But I do know one thing. I don't patrol Ridgewood and Elm anymore, and I never will again. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the suffocating silence. Red and blue lights bounced off the buildings as the backup finally arrived. 2 cruisers screeched to a stop, and officers spilled out, weapons drawn. Their flashlights cut through the dark, beams crisscrossing the street as they called out, "Officer, where's your partner?" One of them yelled, rushing toward me. I pointed weakly toward Brooks. He was lying on the pavement, barely conscious, his body twisted unnaturally. "He's alive, but he needs help," I croaked. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else, raw and strained. "What the hell happened here?" Another officer asked, scanning the area. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what we'd seen? I could already feel their skepticism before the words left my mouth. So I gave them the simplest version of the truth. We were attacked. The suspect got away. They didn't push for details, not then at least. An ambulance arrived, paramedics swarming Brooks and loading him onto a stretcher. He murmured something under his breath as they worked, but I couldn't make it out. His eyes flicked toward me, glazed with fear, before he slipped into unconsciousness. "Are you injured?" a sergeant asked, snapping me out of my daze. I shook my head, though my hands were still trembling. "You're coming back to the station with us. We need to debrief." I nodded mechanically and climbed into one of the cruisers. As we drove, I stared out the window, the streets blurring past. The flickering streetlights seemed to follow us, each one buzzing faintly as we passed beneath it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. At the station, they separated me from Brooks. I sat in a cold interrogation room, a cup of untouched coffee in front of me. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Hargrove, sat across the table. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "All right, officer," he said, his tone low and steady. "I need the truth. What happened out there?" I hesitated, my mind racing. If I told him everything, he'd think I'd lost it. But if I left out too much, they'd start digging, and the last thing I wanted was for them to pull that dashcam footage. Because if they did, they'd see it, the thing. And then what? Would they believe their own eyes? Or would they bury it just like I was trying to? We responded to a 911 call about a suspicious individual. I began, carefully choosing my words. When we arrived, the suspect attacked us. He was extremely fast, strong. I fired my weapon, but it didn't stop him. He disappeared before backup arrived. Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Disappeared. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. It was dark. Maybe he slipped into an alley or something. I don't know." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "And Brooks? What happened to him?" I hesitated. "The suspect threw him hard. He's lucky to be alive." Hargrove studied me for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Finally, he sighed and stood. "All right, we'll write it up as an assault on officers. But I'm going to need a full report by morning." "Yes, sir," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't go home that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat in the locker room, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. The events of the night replayed in my mind, over and over, each detail more vivid than the last. I thought about the thing's faceless head, the way it moved, the way it seemed to defy reality. And then there was Brooks. What had it done to him? Was he the same person who'd walked into that cloud of darkness with me? Or had it left some piece of itself behind, burrowed inside him? My phone buzzed on the bench beside me. It was a text from an unknown number. "It knows your name." My blood ran cold. I looked around the empty locker room, half expecting to see it standing in the shadows. But I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The lights flickered, and then the breathing started again. The breathing grew louder, more distinct, and it was coming from everywhere at once. I shot up from the bench, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My heart was pounding in my chest, the kind of panic that overrides rational thought. "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning around. My voice echoed in the empty locker room, but there was no answer, just the sound of that raspy, wet exhale. I reached for my gun, only to remember I'd left it in my locker, secured as per protocol. My mind raced, every nerve screaming at me to get out, but my legs felt like they were encased in cement. The lights flickered again, dimming for a fraction of a second longer this time. When they came back, the room felt wrong. The rows of lockers stretched farther than they should have, the shadows between them longer and darker. And then I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, partially hidden by the shadows, was the thing. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its head tilted, that same predatory posture. But now, in the harsh fluorescent light, I could see more details. Its form was no longer just an outline of emptiness. It was shifting, rippling, as if it were made of smoke trapped in a glass container. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Stay away," I shouted, even though I knew it wouldn't listen. The thing didn't charge this time. It didn't need to. It simply started to dissolve, breaking apart into black tendrils of smoke that slithered along the floor and walls, consuming the light as they moved. The breathing followed, closer now, surrounding me. I grabbed my phone from the floor and stumbled toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. But when I pulled it open, I wasn't greeted by the familiar sight of the station hallway. Instead, I was staring into a void. Not darkness, not shadow, a complete and utter absence of reality. It felt alive, a pulsating nothingness that seemed to pull at me, drawing me closer. My grip on the door handle tightened as I fought against it, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. And then I heard it, a voice, low and distorted, like it was being dragged through static. "You don't belong here." The words sent a jolt through my body, snapping me out of my trance. I slammed the door shut, collapsing against it as my chest heaved. The locker room was silent again, the light steady. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then my phone buzzed. I hesitated before picking it up, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. There was another text from the same unknown number. "It won't stop. Not until you remember." "What the hell does that mean?" I muttered, my voice barely audible. I wanted to believe it was some sick prank, but deep down, I knew better. The thing wasn't just attacking, it was targeting me. I needed answers, and there was only one place to get them: the footage. I made my way to the surveillance room, the sterile hum of the station's electronics oddly comforting. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow as I walked in. "Late night?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a weak smile. "Just need to check something on the Ridgewood footage." He shrugged and handed me the keycard. "Knock yourself out." Inside, the room was lined with monitors, each one displaying a different feed from the city's camera network. I sat down and pulled up the archive for Ridgewood and Elm. The timestamp was still burned into my mind. 12:34 a.m., the moment everything started. The footage loaded, grainy and jittery, but clear enough. At first, it showed exactly what I remembered. Brooks and me pulling up in the cruiser, stepping out, drawing our weapons. Then came the thing, its faceless form emerging from the alley. But as I watched, something was off. The camera wasn't just recording us, it was focusing on me. The angle shifted slightly as I moved, the lens zooming in, as if it were watching me specifically. And then I saw something that froze my blood. In the moments before the thing appeared, there was a shadow behind me. Just for a second, barely noticeable. It wasn't Brooks. It wasn't the cruiser. It was me, a second version of myself, standing in the alley, watching everything unfold. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse thundering in my ears. The shadowy figure was unmistakable. It had my build, my uniform, even the way I shifted my weight when I was nervous. But it wasn't just standing there. It was staring at me. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just some glitch in the footage. It was me, but it wasn't. The shadow me moved subtly, tilting its head in a way I never remembered doing. Then, just before the thing with no face appeared, it turned and walked back into the alley, dissolving into the darkness. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my breath fogging up the screen. The room felt colder now, the sterile hum of the monitors growing faint. My gut told me to stop, to walk away, but something deeper, the need for answers, kept me rooted to the chair. I fast-forwarded the footage, past the attack, past the moment the thing dissolved. The camera lingered on Brooks and me as backup arrived. Then, just as the officers began loading Brooks into the ambulance, the screen glitched. It was subtle at first, a faint static crawling across the bottom of the feed. But then the entire image warped, the scene twisting and contorting until it became something else entirely. The footage wasn't of Ridgewood and Elm anymore. It was of a room. A cold, dark room with walls that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. In the center was a single chair, and in that chair was me. My stomach dropped. The me on the screen looked battered, beaten, my uniform torn and bloodied. My head hung low, my hands tied behind my back. The camera zoomed in slowly, the static growing louder. And then the me on the screen lifted its head. His face was gone, just like the thing in the alley. I recoiled from the monitor, my chair screeching against the tile floor. The screen went black, the static cutting off abruptly. I stared at the blank monitor, my chest heaving. "Stop this," I muttered to no one in particular. "Just stop." The door to the surveillance room creaked open behind me. I whipped around, hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm, but it wasn't there. I'd left it in my locker. Standing in the doorway was Brooks. He looked pale, his face slick with sweat, but his eyes, they weren't his. They were dark, like pits, with faint glimmers of light that danced unnaturally. He smiled, a cold, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Brooks," I asked, my voice shaky, "what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the hospital." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. "You shouldn't have looked," he said, his voice layered with something else. Something deep and distorted, like multiple voices speaking in unison. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, backing away. "What's going on?" "You let it in," he said, taking another step forward. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as if he were being controlled. "It showed you the truth, and now it's a part of you." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my voice betrayed the lie. Brooks, or whatever was inside him, smiled wider. "You will." And then the lights went out again. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on me like a living thing. I stumbled backward, crashing into the desk. My hand groped for something, anything, to defend myself, but all I felt was cold metal and cables. The breathing started again, louder this time, like it was right in my ear. And then, just as quickly as the lights went out, they flickered back on. Brooks was gone. The monitors, however, were not blank anymore. Every single one displayed the same image. the chair in the dark room. And this time, the me in the chair was looking directly at the camera, its featureless face somehow conveying one chilling message. You can't escape. The screens flickered, and for a moment I thought they'd shut off. But instead, the image changed. The camera zoomed out, revealing more of the room. The me in the chair wasn't alone anymore. Figures began to materialize from the shadows. One by one, their movements jerky and wrong. At first, they looked human, men, women, even children. But as they stepped closer to the light, their forms twisted. Some had no faces, others had too many. Limbs bent at impossible angles, joints creaking like rusted hinges. And all of them were staring at me. The me in the chair didn't react. It just sat there motionless as the figures closed in. One by one, they reached out, touching its head, shoulders, arms. With every touch, the shadows around the chair grew darker, swallowing it inch by inch. Couldn't look away. It felt like the scene wasn't just playing out on the monitors. It was happening to me, here, in this room. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. I tried to scream, to move, but I was frozen. And then the screen glitched again. This time, the camera feed shifted to a live view of the surveillance room. Of me. I was standing there, staring at the monitors, my face pale and terrified. But something was wrong. My reflection on the screen wasn't moving the same way I was. While I gasped for air and clutched the desk, the me on the screen stood perfectly still, head tilted just slightly to the side. And then it smiled. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like the edges of its mouth were being pulled apart by invisible hooks. My reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the screen. I flinched, stepping back, but the hand didn't stop. It pushed through the glass, the surface rippling like water. I stumbled, falling to the floor as the hand stretched out toward me. It wasn't flesh. It was something darker, something wrong. Tendrils of shadow writhed around its edges, reaching for my face. Get away! I screamed, kicking out at nothing. The hand paused, hovering inches from my face. And then the voice came again. Low, distorted, and familiar. You already let me in. I don't remember how I got out of the surveillance room. The next thing I knew, I was outside the station, my hands bloodied from clawing at the door to escape. My breath fogged in the freezing night air, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. The city was silent. Too silent. No traffic, no distant hum of life, just the oppressive weight of emptiness. I looked around, half expecting to see the things standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. For now, I climbed into my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The dashboard lights flickered as the engine roared to life, casting faint shadows across the interior. I stared at the rearview mirror, half hoping and half dreading what I might see. First, it was empty, just the back seat, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. And then it tilted its head. My reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was the thing, its void-like face staring back at me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. You can't run, it said, its voice a whisper that filled the car. You belong to me now. The mirror shattered, shards raining down onto the seats. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out of the lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. It's been weeks since that night. I haven't gone back to work. I haven't told anyone the full story. How could I? They'd think I'd lost my mind, and maybe I have. But it doesn't matter. None of it matters. Because every time I look in a mirror, I see it. Watching. Waiting. And I know deep down that one day I won't be able to tell the difference between it and me. I've spent every moment since that night trying to understand what happened. I've combed through police reports, surveillance footage, and every damn urban legend I could find. But nothing can explain the thing I saw, the thing that still lives inside me. I moved out of my apartment, left the city entirely. I thought maybe distance would help, that I could outrun it. But you can't outrun what's already part of you. Every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even still water, shows its shape now, lurking just beneath my own. At first, it stayed in the background, barely noticeable. But over time, it's been creeping closer. When I blink, it blinks. When I move, it moves. It mimics me so perfectly that some days I forget which of us is real. I've started avoiding mirrors entirely. My new apartment has none, and I keep the windows covered. But even that isn't enough. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll hear it. The soft, wet breathing. The scrape of something metallic dragging across the floor. And last week, it spoke again. Soon. Yesterday, I got a package in the mail. No return address. No markings except my name scrawled in a shaky, almost childlike handwriting. Inside was a single VHS tape, unmarked, old and worn. My hands trembled as I loaded it into the player, knowing I shouldn't, knowing I had no choice. The tape started with static, hissing, and flickering. And then the image came into focus. A chair, bathed in a sickly yellow light. The camera zoomed in slowly, revealing someone sitting there, tied and slumped forward. It was me. The me in the chair lifted its head, and for a moment, I thought it might be free of the thing. But then it tilted its head, that same predatory motion I'd seen so many times. It leaned closer to the camera, its face twisting and flickering between my own and the faceless void. "There's no escape," it whispered. "You were mine the moment you looked. I smashed the TV, the tape, everything. But I know it doesn't matter. I can feel it now, stronger than ever. It's not just in the mirrors anymore. It's in my head, in my thoughts, threading itself through every moment of my life. Tonight, I'm writing this because I know what's coming. The thing doesn't want to haunt me forever. It wants to replace me. And when it does, I wonder, will anyone even notice? Or will it be so perfect, so seamless, that no one will ever know I'm gone? If you're reading this, I need you to do one thing. Don't look. Whatever it is, whatever you see, turn away. Close your eyes. Because the moment you see it, it sees you. And once it sees you, it's already too late.